Story 1. I've been a funeral director for almost 20 years now, working at Thornhill Funeral Home in the small town of Lakeview. Most people find my profession morbid, but I've always found a certain peace in providing dignity to those who've passed and comfort to those left behind. That was until last winter, when something happened that I still can't explain. It was mid-January, and we were in the midst of the worst blizzard I'd seen in decades. The wind howled through the trees, and snow piled up against the windows of the funeral home. Most of the staff had gone home early to beat the storm, but I stayed behind to prepare the body of Dorothea Wilkes, an elderly woman who had passed away in her sleep at the age of 93. Dorothea had been a fixture in our town, a retired school teacher who taught generations of Lakeview children. Her service was scheduled for following afternoon, and I wanted everything to be perfect despite the weather. The preparation room is in the basement of our Victorian-era building. It's clinical and sterile, with bright fluorescent lights that eliminate any shadow, a stark contrast to the warm, comforting atmosphere we maintain upstairs for families. I had just finished with Dorothea's embalming and was applying her makeup when the first strange thing happened, a whisper. So faint I almost missed it beneath the howling wind outside. I paused, makeup brush hovering over Dorothea's pale cheek. The whisper came again, not from the stairs or the ventilation system, but seemingly from right in front of me, from Dorothea. Probably just the wind playing tricks, I muttered to myself, continuing my work. But deep down, I knew the basement was practically soundproof. I finished her makeup and arranged her silver hair the way her daughter had requested, then stepped back to ensure everything looked natural. That's when I noticed her left hand seemed to be in a slightly different position than I had placed it. Instead of lying flat alongside her body, the fingers were now slightly curled. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter storm raging outside. I'd been alone in the room the entire time, and I knew I had positioned her hands properly. Just my imagination, I said aloud, more to fill the silence than anything else. I adjusted her hand back to its proper position and decided to take a quick break upstairs. In my office, I poured myself a cup of coffee and tried to shake off the uneasiness. On my desk sat the small personal items that had been in Dorothea's possession when she passed. A silver locket, a handkerchief with embroidered violets, and an antique silver hairpin that her family wanted her to be buried with. After finishing my coffee, I headed back down to complete my work. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately, but for about 30 seconds, I was in total darkness. When the lights finally came back on, I approached Dorothea's body and froze. Her head was turned slightly toward the door, as if she'd been watching for my return, and clutched in her right hand the silver hairpin that I had left upstairs on my desk. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I brought the hairpin down without remembering? Had I moved her head during the preparation without realizing it? I'm meticulous about my work, and neither seemed possible. Just as I was about to reach for the hairpin, I heard it again, that whisper. This time, it was clear enough that I could almost make out words. Almost, but not quite. It was like listening to a conversation in another room, the sounds forming shapes that were just beyond understanding. The temperature in the room seemed to drop significantly. My breath fogged in front of my face, which was impossible given our climate control system. The whispers continued, growing not louder but somehow more insistent. With shaking hands, I finished my preparations, trying to ignore the sound that seemed to follow me around the room. When I finally turned to leave, I could have sworn I heard a single word, clear as day: Magnus. My name that no one had used in years. Not since I'd started going by my middle name after college. But Dorothea would have known it. She had been my third-grade teacher. After all, I spent that night in my apartment above the funeral home, listening to the storm and unable to sleep. The next morning, the roads were clear enough for the service to proceed. Dorothea's funeral went smoothly, too smoothly, perhaps. Throughout the service, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that someone was watching me. After everyone had left and Dorothea was laid to rest in our town cemetery, I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 nights later, I was awakened by the sound of whispering coming from downstairs. I followed it to the preparation room, but found nothing out of place. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the embalming table that made my blood run cold. A single violet petal from Dorothea's handkerchief. The whispers have continued in the months since then. I hear them most often at night, but sometimes they come in the middle of the day while I'm with clients or preparing another body. I've checked the building's foundation, the ventilation system, everything that could possibly create such sounds. Nothing. Last week, as I was closing up the night, I heard it again, that same whisper, now forming words I could understand. Not my time, Magnus. She took my time. I visited Dorothea's grave the next day. The groundskeeper mentioned something odd. Despite the spring weather, no grass would grow over her plot. And sometimes, he said, if you stand there at dusk, you can hear a woman whispering. I haven't told anyone else about this. Who would believe me? But I've started researching Dorothea's life more carefully, trying to understand what she meant. Who took her time? And why can't she rest? All I know for certain is that I no longer find peace in my work. Instead, with each body I prepare, I find myself listening for whispers that might tell me I'm not the only one who hears the dead. Story 2. I've been in this business for 30 years, but nothing prepared me for Thaddeus Blackwood's funeral. Not the funeral itself. Thaddeus was just another elderly gentleman who passed peacefully in his sleep after a long battle with heart disease. No, it was what happened during the service that I still can't explain. Let me back up a bit. My name is Sybil Crane, and I run Crescent City Funeral Home in New Orleans Garden District. It's a family business. My grandmother started in the 1940s, my father took over in the 70s, and I've been the director since he retired 15 years ago. In a city like New Orleans, where death is practically a cultural celebration, I've seen my fair share of unusual mourners. But this one was different. The first time I noticed him was actually at Thaddeus's viewing. A tall, gaunt man in an impeccably tailored black suit that seemed just slightly out of fashion. Not vintage exactly, but somehow not quite current either. He stood in the far corner of the parlor, partially obscured by one of our large potted ferns. He never approached the casket, never signed the guest book, never spoke to any of the other mourners. He just watched. When the viewing ended, I turned the lock of the parlor and noticed he was gone. I hadn't seen him leave, which struck me as odd, but not alarming. People process grief in different ways. 3 days later, we hosted the funeral of Wilhelmina Porter, a beloved jazz singer who had once performed at Preservation Hall. Her service was packed, standing room only. As I was directing the pallbearers, I glanced toward that same corner and froze. There he was again, the same man, in the same suit, with the same expressionless face. He stood perfectly still while everyone around him wept and swayed to the brass band that played Wilhelmina to her final rest. This time, I decided to approach him after the service. I made my way through the parting crowd, but by the time I reached the corner, he was gone. Again, I hadn't seen him leave. Louisa, I called to my assistant. Did you see that tall gentleman in the black suit? The one who was standing by the fern. She shook her head. Can't say that I did, Miss Sybil. Was he family? No, I replied. At least, I don't think so. Over the next 2 weeks, I spotted him at 4 more services. Zachariah Fleming, a high school football coach. Octavia LaFleur, a 96-year-old matriarch of a local family. Barnabas Wright, a dock worker. Philomena Santos, a 9-year-old girl who'd lost her battle with leukemia. None of these people had any obvious connection to each other. Different ages, different backgrounds, different causes of death. The only thing they had in common was that they were all laid to rest in my funeral home, and that this stranger attended each of their services, always standing in the same corner, always watching. After Philomena's funeral, there's nothing quite as heart-wrenching as burying a child. I was determined to speak with him. I stationed myself near the door, so he couldn't leave without passing me. But somehow, when the service ended and I looked back to his corner, he was already gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face, pale, thin, with deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went down to my office at the funeral home to catch up on paperwork. The building was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old hardwood floors settling. My office is tucked away behind a main parlor, filled with family photos and records dating back to my grandmother's time. As I was going through some files, I came across an old leather album I hadn't seen before. It contained photographs of funerals from the 1930s, when my grandmother first opened the business. I flipped through the yellow pages, admiring the ornate caskets and formal mourning attire of the era. Then I saw it, a photograph of a funeral service dated June 17, 1938. And there in the corner, partially obscured by a large potted fern, was him, the same man, the same suit, the same expressionless face. My hands trembled as I turned more pages. There he was again in a photo from 1942, and 1947, and 1953, always in the background, always in the same position, never aging a day. The next morning, I called my father, who's now in his 80s and living in a retirement community across town. "Dad," I asked after our usual pleasantries, "do you remember a very tall, thin man who used to attend services when you were running the funeral home? Always wore the same black suit, always stood in the corner by the fern." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. "Dad, how do you know about him?" My father's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been seeing him at services," I explained, "and then last night I found some old photographs." "Listen to me, Sybil," my father interrupted. "My mother told me about him when I took over. She said he'd been coming to services since she opened the doors in '38. She called him the witness." My skin prickled with goosebumps. "Did she ever speak to him?" "Once," my father said. "Only once. She asked him why he came to all the funerals of people he didn't know." "What did he say?" Another long pause. "He told her he didn't know them. He knew all of them. He was the funeral home's first client." I nearly dropped the phone. "What do you mean?" "The first body my mother ever prepared," my father explained, his voice shaking slightly, "was a man named Theodore Winters. Tall, thin man who was found dead in his apartment with no family to claim him. The city paid for a pauper's burial." "That's impossible," I whispered, though I was already flipping to the album again, searching for the earliest photographs. I found on the last page a faded picture of my grandmother standing beside an open casket. The casket held the body of a tall, thin man in a black suit. The next day, I pulled the old records from our basement storage. Theodore Winters died June 2nd, 1938. No known relatives. Cause of death, unknown. Buried in the paupers section of St. Louis Cemetery No. 3. I visited the grave that afternoon. It was unmarked except for a small numbered stone flush with the ground. As I stood there, I felt a chill despite the warm New Orleans sun. "Why?" I whispered to the empty air. "Why do you keep coming back?" I didn't expect an answer, but as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. There, partially hidden behind a nearby tomb, was a tall figure in a black suit. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Somehow I understood. He wasn't haunting my funeral home. He was its guardian, its witness. He was making sure that everyone, even those with no family left, had someone to see them off. I still see him at every service. I no longer try to approach him. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I do nod to him now, a silent acknowledgement between professionals. After all, we're both in the business of honoring the dead. Story 3. The Calloway family insisted their matriarch Imogene be buried with her wedding ring. It wasn't anything extravagant, a simple gold band with a modest diamond. But Imogene had worn it for 63 years, never once taken it off since the day Clarence Calloway had slipped it on her finger in 1956. The family was adamant. The ring stayed with Imogene for eternity. I'm Orson Wade, head mortician at Peaceful Passages Memorial Center in downtown Atlanta. I've handled thousands of bodies over my 22-year career, and I'm known for my attention to detail, which is why what happened with Imogene Calloway's ring still haunts me. The day after her passing, Imogene's body arrived at our facility. Her daughter Vivian handed me a typed list of instructions: emerald green dress, pearl earrings, light makeup. Mother always said too much makeup on a corpse looks ridiculous, and most importantly, her wedding ring was to remain on her left hand. Of course, I assured Vivian. We'll make sure she looks beautiful, and the ring won't leave her finger. After the family left, I began the embalming process. As per protocol, I removed Imogene's ring for procedure, placing it carefully in a label container on my workstation. With bodies, I learned to be systematic. Everything has its place. Every step follows precise order. There's comfort in the routine, a certain dignity in the methodical care of those who can no longer care for themselves. When the embalming was complete, I dressed Imogene in her emerald dress, applied subtle makeup to her papery skin, and reached for the ring container. It was empty. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding. The container was right where I'd placed it, but the ring was gone. I checked my pockets, the floor, the sink drains. Nothing. I searched every inch of that preparation room twice over. The ring had simply vanished. I'd never lost a personal effect before, let alone something as significant as a wedding ring that was explicitly meant to accompany the deceased. My reputation, my career, everything I'd built could be jeopardized. But more than that, I'd failed in my duty to Imogene and her family. With the viewing scheduled for following afternoon, I had no choice but to call the family and confess. Vivian was surprisingly understanding, if disappointed. She said they would bring a replacement ring, a costume jewelry piece that had belonged to Imogene, for the viewing. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the entire preparation in my mind, trying to pinpoint when the ring could have disappeared. Around 3 a.m., I drifted into an uneasy sleep and had the strangest dream. I was back in the preparation room, but Imogene was sitting up on the table, fully dressed in her burial clothes. She didn't speak, but pointed insistently toward the refrigeration unit, where we kept another body, an elderly man named Phineas Gould who had passed 2 days before Imogene. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The dream had been so vivid, so unlike my usual forgettable nighttime wanderings. I tried to shake it off, but something compelled me to drive to the funeral home at dawn, hours before my shift was set to begin. The preparation room was exactly as I'd left it. Imogene lay peacefully on her table, ready for her final viewing. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish for letting a dream drive me here at such an hour. As I turned to leave, my eyes fell on the refrigeration unit, the same one from my dream. Phineas Gould was scheduled for cremation that afternoon following a brief private viewing. He had no family, just an estate executor who had made the arrangements. I prepared his body the day before Imogene arrived and hadn't thought about him since. Almost against my will, I found myself opening his refrigeration drawer. Phineas looked just as I'd left him, a thin, scowly-looking man with wispy white hair and glasses we'd set beside him as requested, though he wouldn't be wearing them for the viewing. I was about to close the drawer when something caught my eye, a glint of gold on his right hand. With trembling fingers, I lifted his hand closer to the light. There, on Phineas Gould's pinky finger, was Imogene Calloway's wedding ring. I stared in disbelief. It was impossible. I hadn't been back to Phineas since preparing him 2 days ago. The ring had been securely in the container yesterday while I worked on Imogene. There was absolutely no logical explanation for how it could have migrated from my workstation onto the finger of another deceased person inside a closed refrigeration unit. I carefully removed the ring and returned to Imogene, placing it on her finger where it belonged. As I did, a wave of coldness washed over me, raising goosebumps on my arms despite the warmth of the room. "What's going on here?" I whispered, though I expected no answer from either of my silent companions. Later that morning, I discreetly called the executor handling Phineas Gould's estate, asking if he knew of any connection between Phineas and the Calloway family. The executor seemed surprised by my question, but confirmed he didn't think so. Phineas had been a retired history professor who largely kept himself after his wife died 20 years ago. Just as I was about to hang up, he added, although, come to think of it, he did mention a woman named Imogene in his will. Left her his book collection, but we couldn't locate her. Assumed she preceded him in death. My skin prickled. "Do you know her last name?" or her relationship to Mr. Gould. No last name in the will. Just to Imogene, the love I lost to circumstance, I leave my library, the only true wealth I possessed. Rather poetic for a legal document, actually. I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. Had Imogene and Phineas known each other? Had they been lovers before she married Clarence? Or perhaps an affair? Is that why the ring had mysteriously traveled to his hand? Some final cosmic acknowledgement of a bond that had remained hidden in life? That afternoon, both viewings went perfectly. The Calloway family was pleased to see the original ring on Imogene's finger. I explained I found it lodged in a sink trap, which they accepted without question. Phineas had his small, dignified service with only the executor and 2 former colleagues in attendance. No one would ever know about the ring's impossible journey except me. As the crematorium operator wheeled Phineas away, I could have sworn I heard a whisper in the empty viewing room where Imogene still lay, "Thank you." I never told anyone this story. Who would believe me? But several months later, when clearing out old files, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In 1953, 3 years before she married Clarence, Imogene had worked as a secretary at the university where Phineas taught. They had been engaged briefly, according to a small newspaper clipping tucked into Phineas's intake paperwork, which the executor must have included. The engagement had been broken when Imogene's family forbade the match, deeming a professor's salary insufficient. 2 souls separated by circumstance in life, reunited, however briefly, in my care. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the preparation room late at night, I think about Imogene and Phineas. I wonder if the dead speak to each other in ways we can't comprehend. And I wonder how many other secrets lie with the bodies that pass through my hands, connections and histories I'll never know, final wishes that transcend even death itself. Story 4. When the Shepherd family requested a closed casket service for their son Tobias, I thought nothing of it. Closed caskets aren't unusual in my line of work. Sometimes the deceased's appearance has been altered by illness or accident, and the family prefers to remember them as they were in life rather than how they appeared in death. My name is Lyra Blackwood. I run Blackwood Family Funeral Home in Pine Grove, a small rural community where everyone knows everyone else's business. My great-grandfather started this funeral home back in 1922, and it's been passed down through the generations. I took over from my father 10 years ago when arthritis made it impossible for him to continue the delicate work required. The Shepherd family had lived in Pine Grove for generations, just like mine. Tobias was their only son, a quiet boy who kept himself and rarely participated in community events. The official story was that he died in a hiking accident, fallen from a cliff while exploring the mountains that surrounded our little valley. His body had been recovered by forest rangers and identified by his father, who then arranged for it to be brought directly to our funeral home. Something about the situation felt off from the beginning. Mr. Shepherd was oddly insistent about the closed casket, refusing even to allow me to prepare the body properly. "Just put him in the casket as is," he'd said gruffly. "Nail it shut and don't open it for any reason." In my experience, grief takes many forms, and who was I to question a father's wishes for his son's funeral? So I agreed, though it went against every professional instinct I had. At the very least, I should have embalmed the body, especially since there would be 3 days between delivery and the funeral service. The first strange occurrence happened that very night. I was going through my closing routine, turning off lights and making sure everything was secure, when I heard a thud from the viewing room where Tobias's casket had been placed. It was followed by a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the hardwood floor. I froze, listening intently. The funeral home is old, with creaky floorboards and settling foundations, but this was different, more deliberate. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from my office, it doubles as a decent weapon in a pinch, and slowly made my way to the viewing room. Everything appeared normal. The casket sat undisturbed on its stand, surrounded by the flower arrangements that had already started arriving. The windows were secure, and there was no sign anyone had entered. I was about to leave when I noticed something, a smudge on the polished wooden floor near the casket, as if something had been dragged through a patch of dirt and then across the floor. I told myself it was probably from one of the flower deliveries. Still, I checked all the locks twice before leaving that night. The next morning, I arrived to find several items in my office had been moved, not dramatically, but just enough to notice. The mug I always keep on the right side of my desk was on the left. The stack of funeral programs I'd left neatly aligned was slightly askew. My chair, which I always push in when I leave, was pulled out a few inches. Again, there was no sign of a break-in. The funeral home has a security system, but it's admittedly outdated. Better at detecting someone breaking in from outside than monitoring movements within. Throughout the day, small, inexplicable things continued to happen. Cold spots appeared in rooms that had been warm moments before. Lights flickered without explanation. One of my assistants reported hearing whispers coming from the empty embalming room. "Maybe the place is haunted," she suggested with a nervous laugh. I'd been in this building my entire life and had never experienced anything supernatural before. But as the day wore on, even I began to wonder. That night, I decided to stay late and set up a small camera facing the viewing room. I didn't mention this to anyone. Not my staff, not the Shepherds. I told myself it was just to rule out any ordinary explanation, like a raccoon that had somehow gotten inside or a draft moving things around. I was in my office reviewing the arrangements for another funeral when the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in front of me, and the lights dimmed momentarily before brightening again. Then I heard it, a distinct scratching sound coming from the viewing room. Slow, methodical scratching, like fingernails on wood. My heart hammered in my chest as I pulled up the camera feed on my computer. The viewing room appeared empty except for the casket and flowers. The scratching continued, definitely coming from inside the casket. I should have called someone, the police, Mr. Shepherd, anyone. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and a crowbar from the maintenance closet and made my way to the viewing room. The scratching grew louder as I approached, more frantic now, accompanied by what sounded like labored breathing. Standing before the casket, I hesitated. Mr. Shepherd's warning echoed in my mind. Don't open it for any reason. But what if someone was in there? What if Tobias hadn't been dead when they brought him in? The thought made me sick, but I couldn't ignore the possibility. With trembling hands, I wedged a crowbar under the lid and pried it open. The casket was empty. No body, no clothes, nothing but the satin lining, which showed signs of disturbance, wrinkles and tears that suggested something had been thrashing inside. I stared in disbelief, unable to process what I was seeing. A cold breeze brushed past me, and I heard a whisper so close it could have been in my ear. "Thank you." I slammed the lid shut and backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get out of the room. I ran to my office and pulled up the security footage, rewinding to earlier in the evening. The footage showed nothing unusual until about an hour before I heard the scratching. Then the lid of the casket slowly rose, seemingly on its own. A pale hand emerged, followed by an arm, a shoulder, and finally a head. It was difficult to make out details in the grainy footage, but it was clearly a young man with dark hair, Tobias, I presumed. He climbed out of the casket, stood shakily, and looked directly at the camera for a moment before walking out of frame. I searched the entire building, but there was no sign of him. All doors and windows remained locked from the inside. It was as if he had simply vanished. The next morning, I called Mr. Shepherd, my voice carefully controlled as I asked him to come to the funeral home immediately. When he arrived, I led him to the viewing room and opened the casket without preamble. His face drained of color, but he didn't look surprised. "Where is he?" I demanded. "What's going on here?" Mr. Shepherd sank into a chair, suddenly looking every bit his 60 years. "He's gone home," he said quietly. "What do you mean gone home? Was he even dead? Was this some kind of sick joke?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. Tobias has always been different. 3 days ago, he stopped breathing. No pulse, no brain activity. The doctors declared him dead, but it's happened before. "What has happened before?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "He comes back, always on the third night. We hoped this time would be different." I didn't know what to say. This defied everything I knew about death. And I knew quite a bit. The funeral was canceled. The shepherds moved away shortly after. I never saw Tobias again, though sometimes on quiet nights when I'm alone in the funeral home, I feel a cold spot pass by me, and I wonder. I've never told anyone else this story. Who would believe me? A funeral director claiming a body disappeared from a sealed casket? I'd be laughed out of profession. But I know what I saw, and I know now that sometimes death isn't as permanent as we think. Story 5. Millionaire recluse Octavia Harrington left very specific and unusual funeral instructions. I've handled odd requests before: burials at sea, cremated remains shot into space, even a gentleman who wanted to be interred with his vintage motorcycle. But Octavia's demands were in a category all their own. My name is Solomon Pierce. I own Elegant Passages, an upscale funeral home catering to Boston's elite. My clients expect discretion, attention to detail, and a willingness to accommodate even their most eccentric final wishes. In this business, you learn not to judge. Death comes for everyone, and who am I to question how someone wants to make their exit? I'd never met Octavia Harrington personally until after her death. She had no family, having outlived her husband by 3 decades and never having children. Her lawyer, a tight-lipped man named Harrison Webb, handled all the arrangements. Webb arrived at my funeral home, clutching a thick envelope sealed with dark red wax. Ms. Harrington was quite insistent that only you read these instructions, Webb told me, passing over the envelope, and that they remain confidential. I nodded, used to such requests from private individuals. Of course. There's one more thing, Webb added, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. Ms. Harrington specifically requested you, not your funeral home, you personally. She left quite explicit instructions that if Solomon Pierce does not handle her arrangements exactly as specified, her considerable estate will go entirely to her cats rather than the charitable foundation she established. This wasn't entirely surprising. The wealthy often develop peculiar fixations in their later years. I'll ensure everything is done according to her wishes, I assured him. After Webb left, I broke the wax seal and began reading Octavia's instructions. Most were standard enough: specific flowers, white lilies and black roses, music selections, Chopin's funeral march predictably, and a guest list consisting mainly of business associates rather than friends. But then came the unusual part. The night before burial, at precisely midnight, the funeral director must perform the enclosed ritual in the presence of my body. No others may be present. This is non-negotiable. The ritual turned out to be a series of phrases in a language I didn't recognize, accompanied by specific movements to be performed around the casket, culminating in placing a small silver key, included in the envelope, into Octavia's hand and closing her fingers around it. My first instinct was to dismiss this as the eccentric request of a woman who had clearly lost touch with reality in her final years. But something about the precision of the instructions gave me pause. This wasn't the rambling of a senile mind. Every detail was methodical, deliberate. And then there was the matter of payment. Octavia had arranged for my services to be compensated at 5 times my usual rate, with a substantial bonus to be delivered after confirmation that the ritual had been performed correctly. Money has never been my primary motivation in this profession, but I'd be lying if I said the amount didn't influence my decision to proceed. The day of the funeral arrived. Octavia's body had been prepared according to her instructions, dressed in a vintage black gown with an unusual silver brooch pinned at her throat. Her white hair was arranged in an elegant updo, and her makeup was subtle but effective at disguising the ravages of the cancer that had ultimately claimed her life. The viewing went smoothly. Business associates filed past, paying respects that felt perfunctory at best. I noticed that none lingered at the casket, and few seemed genuinely grieved by her passing. Octavia had apparently been respected, perhaps even feared, but not loved. As midnight approached, I locked the doors of the funeral home and dimmed the lights in the viewing room, leaving only the candles Octavia had specified burning on either side of her casket. I felt slightly foolish as I prepared to perform the ritual, but I'd given my word, and in my profession, keeping promises to the dead is a matter of honor. I began reciting the unfamiliar phrases, moving around the casket as instructed. The words felt strange on my tongue, the syllables harsh and angular. As I continued, something odd happened. The words began to feel familiar, as if I'd known them all along. My movements became more fluid, automatic. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. The candle flame stretched tall and thin, barely flickering despite the chill in the air. When I placed the silver key in Octavia's hand and curled her stiff fingers around it, I felt a jolt like static electricity, but somehow deeper, resonating in my bones. And then the memories began. Not my memories. Hers. Octavia as a young woman in the 1950s, standing over the body of her much older husband, a similar key clutched in her hand. Octavia in the 1970s, performing the same ritual I was now conducting, but over the body of a middle-aged man I somehow knew had been her business partner. Octavia in the 1990s, again with a ritual, this time with a young female protege who had threatened to expose some financial impropriety. Each memory was crystal clear, filled with details only someone who had been present could know. I could smell the cologne her husband had worn, feel the texture of her business partner's cashmere suit under my fingertips, taste the champagne she'd sipped before dealing with her troublesome protege. With each memory came knowledge, complex financial dealings, business strategies, political connections, and other, darker knowledge, secrets and lies, manipulations and betrayals. An entire lifetime of accumulated wisdom and power flooding into my mind. I staggered back from the casket, breaking contact with Octavia's hand. The flood of memories ceased immediately, but what I'd already absorbed remained. I understood now what the ritual was for. Octavia had found a way to preserve her knowledge, her experiences, her essence. She'd been doing it for decades, jumping from one funeral director to another, collecting their memories and experiences while sharing her own. I looked down at her body with new understanding. This wasn't her first death. How many funeral directors had she used over the years? How many bodies had she inhabited before finding this method of transferring herself without physically possessing the other person? I knew what would happen if I completed the ritual. I would become a vessel, still myself, but with Octavia riding along, her memories and knowledge intertwined with mine. She would influence my decisions, perhaps eventually take control entirely. And when my body grew old, she would find another funeral director, another ritual, another vessel. The smart thing would be to walk away now, to bury her with the key still clutched in her hand, the ritual incomplete. No amount of money was worth becoming someone else's puppet, but the memories I'd already absorbed whispered of power, of influence, of secrets that could open any door. And hadn't I always been curious about what lay beyond death? Here was my answer, not an end, but a transformation. My hand trembled as I reached out toward Octavia's again, the decision hanging in the balance. The candle flame stretched taller, eager, waiting. What would you do if death offered you a different path? I made my choice that night. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of someone else looking back, a flash of Octavia's calculating gaze behind my eyes. And sometimes, when I prepare bodies now, I find myself checking their hands for silver keys.